Hello everyone and welcome to Beginner's Code. Today we are going to learn how we can use Flask logic, object-oriented programming, AJAX and JavaScript libraries to create an expense tracker that you can visualize the data using Chart.js. Okay, so I have created a folder called expense tracker and opened it in my Visual Studio Code and in my terminal. The first thing that we're actually going to do is create a virtual environment. So here we'll just say Python 3-m venv and then my-env. And whilst that is doing its thing, we can then say source my-env bin activate. And now you'll see we've got my-env at the start. So now this is active, I'm going to install Flask. So pip3 install Flask, let that do. And I'll come over to my expense tracker. I'm just going to create a folder called templates and then a second one called static. And then we'll create an app.py in the root directory and a models.py. And then inside the templates, we are going to have a base.html. We'll also have an index.html and then a chart.html, and then in static we're just going to have a script.js. So now what we'll actually get started with is just importing the things that we need to just get our environment set up correctly. So if we say from Flask, import Flask, render template, request, redirect, JSONify, and then URL for. And then here we're just going to create a new variable called app, and then this is going to instantiate the Flask. Now we can create our roots, so we'll use a decorator and we'll say app.root, and this is just going to be the base root, so the first thing that you come to. We'll say def index, so an index function, and we're just going to return render template, and this is just going to be the index.html. So now if we come over to our base.html, we are just going to create a HTML5 boilerplate. And then in here, we'll just create expense tracker. And then because we're using the base.html as the overarching HTML file that the rest of the HTML files will link off, we only need to import our scripts and our links to Tailwind once. So inside this, we'll create a link, and we are just going to link to CDN JS deliver .net /npm /Tailwind CSS, and then 2.2.19. We'll get the dist and then tailwind.min.css. And then we also want a scripts for jQuery, so this is going to be the Google APIs link. So .com /AJAX /libs /jQuery 3.5.1, and then again the minified version. And then to actually output the chart, we're going to use Chart.js. So this is going to be another script. It's going to be another source script, and we'll use the cdn.js deliver .net /npm /chart.js. So now inside the body, we'll just give it a class of bggray100, and then we'll say padding of 1.5 rams. And then in here, we'll give it a div container with mx auto. So that is a margin auto to the right and the left. And then inside this, we're just going to use some Ginger syntaxing, and we'll say block content, and then end block. And because we've got block content and end block, we can then come over to our index.html. And then at the top, we can extend our base.html, and then we can say block content, and then end block. And this basically means that anything that we put inside of this content block will be then output inside of this. So it's all basically running off the same HTML file, but it's just a way of segmenting them into different files. So then here, just to make sure that everything's working correctly, we'll just create a hello world heading one. So we have our app.py roots, and then at the bottom we are just going to say if name is equal to main, then we'll say app.run, and we'll set debug equal to true. And then is there anything else that we need? I think that is correct for the time being. So now if I say Python 3 app.py, we have a development server up and running. And if I open this, so we have an error here saying extend base.html. It's because it's actually extends. And then if I reopen this, we have hello world. So we have this outputting what we have from our index.html file inside the actual body that we created, which also has a container of mxauto. So now if I come back over to Visual Studio Code, if we make sure that we have our scripts added in, so we'll say script source, and then we'll say URL for static, and then file name will just be script.js. And now to make sure this is running, and to make sure that we have jQuery installed correctly, we'll use jQuery and we'll say document ready. And then inside of this, we will create a function. And this is just going to console log hello. So now if we come back over to here and refresh, go down to our console, we get hello output. So we have our jQuery working, our scripts linked up, and Tailwind sorted. So now if I come back over to Visual Studio Code, the first thing that we're actually going to do is create our models. So these models are going to basically handle each expense, and there will be an expense manager. So the expense manager is just going to handle adding and basically CRUD capabilities, but for each expense. So now if we come over to our models and we say import JSON, and then import OS, and here we're going to create two classes. So we'll have class expense and then class expense tracker or manager. And then inside of the expense, we will create an initialization method. This needs the self keyword, and then we need an ID for each expense. We need a category for each expense, and then an amount. So for example, you might have food that costs £200 a month, or you might have car insurance, which costs £1,500 a month. So each one will be different, but it will have a category and an amount, and then an expense ID, which is generated. So we'll say self.expense ID, and we'll set that equal to the expense ID that's passed in when it's instantiated, and then self.category, and again that will be passed in, and then self.amount. And then we want a toDict method, as this will return a dictionary so that we can actually essentially use it with JSON. We need the self keyword so that we can access these attributes up here. I'm just going to return a dictionary that has expense ID, and we'll set that equal to self.expense ID, category, and we'll set that equal to self.category, and then amount, and again that will be set to self.amount. So now if we come down to our expense manager, we also need an initialization method for this, and it needs a file path. So now we can say self.filepath, and this will be set to the file path that we instantiate with. And then on our first instance, we want an expense. So these will basically hold all of the expenses, and this is just going to be an empty list for the time being. We will add to it as and when we create expenses. And then we're just going to say self.load expenses. And this is a function that we will create, but when it's first made, this function is essentially going to take the file path and create a file based on the file path that we've given it. So here we'll say def load expenses needs the self keyword. We'll say if os.path.exists self.file path. Then we're going to say with open self.file path, and then we're going to use the read method, and we'll say as file, and then here we'll just say self.expenses is equal to, and here we're going to instantiate the expense, and we'll pass in the expense as a keyword, and then we're just going to use list comprehension, so we'll say for expense in JSON.load, and we'll pass in the file. So that's going to loop through the file that we're passing. It's going to load all the data, and then it's going to create an instance of each expense and set that to this list here. And then we'll say else self.expenses is equal to an empty list. So if it doesn't exist, then we are creating a list. If it does exist, we are setting this list equal to that file path. Next, we want a function to save the expenses, and we'll say pass in self. And this is going to then open the file again, so self.file path, and we're going to use the write method. And then here we're going to dump to the file, and we will say expense to dict for expense in self.expenses, and then pass the file. So we are dumping, we're going to loop through this list of expenses, and we are going to, for each one, get the dictionary method, and we are going to dump it into the file. So now we have a way to save. We want a way to get all of them. So we'll say def get all expenses. And we're just going to return self.expenses. And now we want a way to actually add an expense. So we'll say def add expenses self category amount. And here we're going to say expense ID is equal to the length of the expenses list. And then we'll add one to the end, just so that we can increment it. And we'll say new expense is equal to, and then we're going to create an instance of it. We'll pass in the expense ID, the category, and then the amount. And we'll say self.expenses.append new expense and self.save expenses. So this is essentially going to add it to this list, but then it's also going to call this function which will save it to the external file as well. Now we need a way to delete the expenses, so def delete expense self expense ID. And then here it's going to say self.expenses is equal to, and then in list comprehension we'll say expense for expense in self.expenses if expense.expense ID is not equal to the expense ID that we have just passed through. So we'll loop through all of the expenses in this list, and then we're going to check each expense to see if the ID of that expense is equal to the ID that we have passed through here. And then we will save the expenses. because we are then essentially rewriting to the file each expense if it's not equal to the expense ID, which in essence is deleting the expense ID that we have. So say this is number 4, and if we are looping through, the one that has an expense ID of the number 4 will not be rewritten to the file. So now we need a way of getting the expense by the category, and this is going to be useful for outputting as a chart. So we'll say def, I'll just make the font slightly bigger. We'll say def get expenses by category, and then the self method. And here we're going to say expenses by category is equal to an empty dictionary. We're going to then loop through the expenses. And here we'll say if the expense.category is in the expenses by category. So if the categories, which say for example is food, if food is in this, then this will run. So here we'll say expenses by category, and then we're going to add to the dictionary expense.category, and then set that equal to an increment of the amount. So say for instance we had food in twice, the first one was 100 and the second one was 150, we're going to add them to the same index of the dictionary and increment it, so it will actually say food is equal to 250. And then we'll say else expenses by category, and then we use the category again, and this is just going to say expense.amount. So because it's the first instance of it, we will just be adding the amount rather than incrementing the amount. And then outside of the for loop, we are just going to return expenses by category. So now we have our expenses classes sorted. So that is the manager, in case you need to pause it. And then this is the expense, just in case you need to pause it again. We are now going to create our apps, our app routes. So here we will need to import what we've just been using. So we'll say from models import expense manager. And then underneath the app, we will say expense manager is equal to expense manager. And here we will just pass in expenses.json. Now we don't need to create a file over here called expenses.json, because this will automatically, if it's not created, it will automatically create it for us. So now in our index, we just need to add slightly to it, and we'll say expenses is equal to expense manager dot get all expenses. And then in this return, we are just going to set expenses equal to the expenses variable that we've just created here. So this now means that the expenses will be accessible in our index.html file. Next, we'll create a route to add an expense. So we need a decorator again, and this is going to take /add expense, and then a method which will be post, and we'll create a def add expense function, and this is going to take a request. So data is equal to request.json, and we'll say expense manager dot add expense. And then we'll take the category from the data, and we'll also take the amount from the data. So these will both be passed through inside of a form. And then we're just going to return JSONify a status, which will say expense added successfully. Now we need to create a route for deleting an expense and viewing the chart. So for deleting an expense, we will create a decorator, and this is going to take delete expense as the root, And then we also need to pass in the ID of the expense. So we'll say integer expense ID. And then it's also going to take a method which will just be delete. And here we'll just say def delete expense and then expense ID. And then we're just going to say expense manager dot delete expense. And then we'll pass in the expense ID, which is passed in when we actually call this route. So that will say delete expense 4, and then we'll pass that through to this function here, which will actually be called down here. And then we'll loop through all of the expenses, and then if the ID is equal to 4, then we will ignore that one, and then we will save the expenses. And then once this is done, we're just going to return JSONify, and then a JSON object, which will actually be a dictionary in Python, and this will just say expense deleted successfully. And then we'll create a new route for the view chart, and here it's just going to be def view chart. And then we're going to get the expenses by the category so that we can pass each expense by category through to the chart.html file. So we'll say expenses by category is equal to expense underscore manager dot get expenses by category, and then return render template. So this is going to render the chart.html, and we will pass through expenses by category, and that will be equal to the expenses by category variable that we have just created here. So now we have our routes sorted. I will leave that there just in case you need to pause it. And then next we will come back over to our index.html, and we can start actually adding some ways for people to input the data that they need. So in the index.html, we can remove this heading 1, and I'm just going to create a new heading 1 that will have text of 3XL, font bold, margin bottom of 6, and then text center. And here it's just going to say expense tracker. And then we'll create a div which will be grid cols 2, and then a gap of 3 rem. And then inside of this grid, we will create a col span 1, which will also have width full, MX auto, BG white, padding of 1.5 rems, rounded corners, a shadow, and then we will say margin bottom of 1.5 rems. And then inside of this, we're going to have the form. So we'll have a heading 2 that has text 2XL, font semi-bold, margin bottom of 4, and we will just have the text say add expense. And now we can create an input of text which has the ID of category. So this is, when it's passed through, is going to hold the category data, which will be passed into this request, and then we can add it through this. So here we can now remove the name. We'll add a placeholder that just says category, and then a class of border, padding of half a rem, and then width full, margin bottom of 3, and then rounded LG. Now if I copy and paste that, we can now change this to the amount. The type will be number. We'll change the placeholder to say amount, and the classes will all be the same, just so they're styled the same and it's all uniform. And now we'll create a button which has the ID of add expense. We'll give it a class that says BG Blue 500, and these are just Tailwind built-in classes, text right, padding top and bottom of half a rem, padding left and right of 1 rem, rounded corners, shadow, and then we'll give it a hover state so that it goes slightly different color when you hover over it, and we'll give it a width full. And this will just say add expense. So now if I come back over to Google Chrome and refresh, we have in our left-hand column the ability to add an expense, and when you hover over the button it changes color slightly. But obviously we haven't hooked this up using AJAX yet, so there is no data that would be passed through. So now if we copy this, we don't need to because we're going to be doing it slightly different. So the next column, which will be again colspan 1, width full, MX auto, BG white, padding of 1.5 rems, rounded LG, and then shadow medium. And then inside of this we're going to create a heading 2, which will have text 2XL, font semi-bold, margin bottom of 1 rem, and this will say your expenses. And then here we're just going to create a unordered list, and this will just say, this will have an ID of expense list. And then here we're going to loop through the expenses that are passed through, so that when you come to the index.html file, if you've already added expenses, they will be showing there. So we'll say for expense in expenses. Now make sure that you add the end for. And then inside this, we'll create an li that has flex, justify between, items center, padding top and bottom of half a rem, and then border bottom. And then inside of this, we'll create a span that just has the expense.category. And then we will give it an amount as well. So in dollars, we'll do this, and we'll say expense.amount. And then after, we'll have a button, and this will have a class of text red 500, and then delete expense. Now we need a way to actually pass in the ID number. So if we create a data attribute, and we'll say data-id, and then we will, again using Ginger syntaxing, we will access the ID of the expense. So we'll say expense.expense ID, and then we'll just say delete. So now these will all be outputted, all of our expenses will be outputted as text with a button that when we click that, we will be able to remove this. So now if we come back to the bottom of our unordered list and we create an A tag, the href is going to say URL4, and we're just going to say view_chart. And then we'll give it a class of margin top 4, inline block, give it a green background with white text, padding to the top and bottom, and padding to the left and right. And then we'll say rounded large, shadow, and then we'll give it a hover state that says VG green 600. And then finally we'll give it width full and text center. And then inside of this we will just say view chart. So now we have our actual layout sorted. If we come back over to here, just make sure that everything's running, and then come back to Google Chrome and refresh. We have our expenses, which would be outputting here. But now we need a way to actually add an expense to make sure that this is all linked up correctly. So if we come over to our scripts.js, I'm just going to make this full screen again. if we come over to our scripts.js, we can then, inside of this document ready, add a event listener that will use an AJAX request. And we'll say add expense, and then .click, and we'll use a function and then inside of this we're just going to get the category, so we'll say var category .val, and then we'll say var amount, .val. So this is getting these IDs here and the values of them. So once this button has been clicked, we are going to get the IDs of these, or the values of these. And then here we are going to say $.ajax, and then we can create an AJAX request. And here we'll say URL, and then / add expense. Type will be post. Content type, we will say application /JSON. And then the data that we're passing through will be a stringified JSON object. And we'll say category. And we'll set that equal to the category variable here. And then we'll say amount. And we're just going to say pass float. And then we'll be passing the amount. And then we can say success. And we'll create a function that returns the response. And then we'll just say alert response.status, and then window.location.reload, and this will just reload the window obviously when you've pressed it, and this will update the right hand side then. And then we can also pass in error, so this will happen if there is an issue, and we'll say response, and then alert response.response.json.status. So now if we come back over to here and refresh, if I create food and we'll say 150, and then we add expense, we get an error with the add expense. So if we come down to here and choose the payload, so we have requested payload working, but then in the preview, expense manager object has no attribute add expense. So if we come back to our Visual Studio Code, okay, so the issue with this route was actually the add expense route was looking for an expense manager that had a method of add expense, whereas the actual method is called add expenses. So if we come back down to here and then add an S, we should be able to add our expense. So here, if we now say food 150, add expense, expense added successfully, and now we have the window reload, which now outputs the food that we have just inputted with our delete button. So if we just double check that there is an ID attached to this delete button, we have data-id of 1, and that will be because it is the first that has been created. So expense ID 1, category food, and then amount 150. So now if we create a way to delete the expense, so coming back to our scripts, if we go down to here, we can say we'll get the delete expense class. So inside the index.html, we have this button here that has a class of delete expense. And here we'll say on click, we're going to create a function that will happen when the button has been clicked. And this is going to say expense ID is equal to this, so the delete button. And then we'll get the attribute of data-id. And we'll say $.ajax. And then here we'll say URL, and we'll pass in delete underscore expense. and then we need to add a trailing slash at the end, and then we'll say plus expense ID. We'll say type delete, and then we're just going to create a success function that returns a response, and then we can just alert the response.status, and then we'll say window.location.reload, and then we'll create an error message, and this will just be a response. And we'll say alert response dot response JSON dot status. So now if we come back to our Chrome and we refresh to make sure that the JavaScript is all linked up correctly, if we press delete, we should actually delete this from the list and from our JSON file. And the reason why nothing happens is because it is not an underscore, it is a dash. But actually, for conventional purposes, I'm going to change this just so it is an underscore, just so that it doesn't interfere with any kind of Tailwind classes. And now if we refresh and click delete, we get expense deleted successfully and it's removed. And then if we come over to our expenses.json, we just have an empty list. Okay, so now we have that functionality working correctly. We now need a way to actually output our chart. So if we come over to chart.html, we also need to extend the base.html, and then we'll say block content, and then at the bottom we are going to end the block, and then here we'll create a heading 1 with 3XL, font bold, margin bottom of 6, and text center, and this will just say expense chart. And then we're going to create a canvas that has an ID of expense chart. We'll say max width of large, and then we'll say MX auto, BG white, padding of 1.5 rems, rounded large, and shadow medium. And then we'll create an aref, which has the URL for index. And then we will give it some classes, so we will say margin top, we'll say display block, and then a max width of 250 pixels. Give it an MX auto, text center, BG blue 500, text white, padding top, and then padding left and right. Sorry, padding top and bottom, padding left and right. Rounded large, shadow, and then we'll give it a BG blue 600 just to make it darker. And then we will say width full, and we're just going to add go back. So now we have our canvas sorted and a way for you to go back. We now need to add in our scripts that will essentially turn the data that we have into a chart. So in here, if we create a script tag, and because this is HTML, we can still add script tags. So we'll say var ctx is equal to document.getElementPyId. And because this is the expense chart or a canvas that we're working with, we can't really use jQuery, and that's because we need to get the context, and this is a JavaScript thing. And then we'll say var expenses is equal to, and because again this is HTML, we can use Ginger syntaxing, so we'll say expenses by category, and then we can filter this and we'll say to JSON. So this will just return it as JSON. It will throw an error because it's inside of a script tag, but you can still use it and it won't actually cause any errors. and then we'll say var labels, and we'll say object.keys, and then expenses, and then var data is equal to object.values expenses. So the labels will be the keys and the data will be the values. And then we're just going to say var chart is equal to new chart, context, and then here we will say type of Py. We'll say data, and we can set a data variable that will have labels. We'll set that equal to the labels we've just created above. And then we'll say data sets will be a list of JSON objects. And here we will say label expenses, data of the data attribute, or the data variable, sorry, above. And then we will have background color. And this is just going to be a list of different RGBA variables. So we'll say RGBA 99132, and then 0.2, so that will be a light pink. And then if I copy and paste this a few times, the second one will be 54, 162, 235, and that will be a light blue. And then we'll have 255, 206, 86, and that will be a yellow. And then we will have 75, 192, 192, and that will be a teal colour. And then we'll have 153, 102, and then 255. That will be a purple. And then we'll have 255, 159, and 64, and that will be an orange. So now we have 6 different colours, so that will be 6 different categories. Obviously, if you wanted this to generate randomly, or if you didn't know how many different colours you would be needing, you can create a function that will randomly generate these numbers, and then you can call it for the length of expenses that we have. But for now, it's easier to just hard code. But obviously, if you want to take this to another level, that is something that you can implement yourself. And then because we have the background colors, we also need to have a list of border colors. And it's essentially going to be exactly the same. So if I copy and paste these, we're just going to change all of the opacity values to be 1. And these will just be much brighter, the colours of the colours that we have up here. And then after the border colour, we're just going to say border width of 1. And then all we need to add now is a couple of options. And this will make it essentially accessible on different devices. So we can say options, and then we'll create an object, say responsive true. And then we'll say plugins, create an object that will say legend, and then we will just position that at the top. So we will have a legend that will essentially say the pink colour is for food, the blue colour is for car insurance, and the yellow colour is for electricity. So now we actually have this all sorted. If I save that there so that you can pause it if you need to. And then if we come back over to Chrome and refresh, if I add a category for food, say 150, so this is 150 a month. And then we'll say car insurance, we will say that is 1,500 a month. And then if we say rent, which we will say 500 a month. And then if you view the chart, we now get taken through to the chart, view chart, and this is massive for some reason. not too sure why. If I say width 250 pixels, so if we come back over to here and then change this max width to just be a width of 250 pixels, it's still doing it, which is very strange. But now you can see how we have been able to add in this Chart.js, and we have the car insurance, we have the food, and we have the rent. And if we go back and we delete the car insurance, we have a status message, and then view the chart, we now just have rent and food. Now you could also take this further and have a way of distributing exactly how much money is spent in total, rather than having to sort of calculate it as you go. So we know that that's 650, but obviously if you were able to add 650 up here, that is obviously something that you can add in yourself. Hopefully this has helped you grasp how we can use object-oriented programming, Flask, AJAX, and external libraries to be able to visualize user data in a more readable format. If you learned something today, please hit that like button and make sure you subscribe to see new videos coming. Thanks, and I'll see you again soon.